Okay.
Those of you on the computer, can you now see both the screen and the participants in the class?
We can see Sean from the shoulders down.
Okay, that's good. I was worried you were only seeing me from the waist down. That would have been embarrassing. Okay. Good. I'm glad and you can see the screen as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and begin. I'm really excited about this lecture because it's one of my all-time favorite things to talk about. Which I am. Right, I have a spiritual effervescence. I have one request. So today, I really want to get through all of the material. So I have two places where I'll allow questions and comments today, about halfway through the lecture and then at the very end as well. So each time that we stop, each time that I talk about, at the end of when I talk about spirit photography, that's when we'll do questions. So be aware of what you want to ask or what you might want to comment, and we'll take some time at, each section there. That microphone doesn't think. I know. Is it the microphone or me? I don't know. Okay. Can you hear me online with the microphone, everybody? I feel like the microphone's being a little odd. Okay, hopefully you can hear me. So, we're going to talk about spiritualism. We're going to talk about Jewish spiritualism. Really quickly, just a quick answer, right? No commentary, quick answer. What is spiritualism? You know what that is. Does everyone know what? I know John and Genevieve know what it is. Does anyone else know? Anybody know what spiritualism is, or have never heard the term before? Never heard the term. Okay.
Like the higher power.
So, no. I mean, yes, in a sense that it refers to something else that's supernatural, but as just being a higher power or belief in a spirit, a great spirit, no, it doesn't mean that. And I'll talk about what it means very shortly. John, goes to church. Yeah, go to church. Okay. So, does anyone know? So, what's happening here is a seance, and this is a seance. A seance is when people get together, and usually like in an intimate space, generally speaking, and they engage in sort of a type of ritual that summons ghosts. If you've ever used or seen a Ouija board, you have used or seen a modern form of seance. Now, there are still seances that happen today. There are spiritualist clubs where people get together and they engage in sorts of rituals that summon spirits. But usually when you see it today, you're going to see it in the form of a Ouija board, or you're going to see it on like a talk show. So, I mean, I don't know what talk shows would still do this, but you might have seen like in the 90s and early 2000s, you may have seen like Oprah Winfrey or Phil Donahue, or whatever, have a medium come and they would do a cult reading with the audience. And they would say, oh, there's a spirit here who's talking, who wants to connect with you. And that actually, it generated widespread fascination, but that has roots like at least 150 years old, in sort of these spiritualist clubs that popped up all around the United States, primarily in the Eastern Seaboard though. And it wasn't just restricted to like mainstream Christian society, although most people who did this were from a Christian background. In the middle to end of the 19th century, this just took off with Jewish communities. Like Jews throughout the world fell in love with spiritualism, just like so many other people throughout the world did as well. And so what you're seeing here in this image is this is a Yiddish what's the word? Manual. It's a Yiddish manual for how to conduct a seance. And so what's basically being said here, I don't read or speak Yiddish, but I did a quick translation on Google Translate. And the basic gist is that it's basically telling you where to put your hands and how to begin certain incantations to bring spirits into the world. And this is again all in Yiddish. Okay. Oh, go ahead. Sometimes it takes a minute to jump forward.
It doesn't love me. Sorry.
But we love you.
Well,
So
thank you.
I have a couple of opening notes here. The first is that there is a slide that has embalmed bodies. I will try to give you a heads up when that comes, if that's of a concern. So definitely you want to turn away. It's nothing gruesome. It's basically they're images of people who have been involved and are dressed up and that sort of thing, but not in a casket. That's relevant to this discussion. If it's of concern to you, I want to give you a quick heads up about that as well. Also, we're going to be talking about the occult, we're going to be talking about ghosts, that sort of thing. I know this really isn't a concern in a Reformed Jewish faith, but I have given this talk before where, especially to students, where this is a concern. In fact, I once had a student come up to me and say, I couldn't tell my mom about what we're talking about here because, she said it would say it's of the devil, right? So I've actually had that happen. So I give this little warning. There are some involved bodies, talk about the occult, talk about ghosts.
Recording in progress.
This particular image, this is not a real ghost. This is a form of spirit photography. I know John's like, oh. This is a form of spirit photography where basically there were all these images that went around in the 19th century into the 20th century, where spiritualist societies and spirit photographers would create these images that would supposedly have ghosts appearing in the background of the image. And so this was a very, very popular medium. It was a very, very popular form of entertainment. And it was both religious behavior and entertainment at the same time. People both believed this and also kind of knew that it was like a little bit out there, which is really fascinating to me, right? There was almost among spiritualists, which at one point was almost every American, there was a sense of like credulity, but no incredulity. Like people knew that this was hucksterism, and yet they still derived spiritual meaning from it. And that's one of the reasons why spiritual photography took off. And in a sense, that's something that we can say about all sorts of aspects of what we might call the New Age, or I have this fancy religious studies term up here called the cultic milieu. And that basically means the spiritual counterculture in America. It refers to a number of different practices and belief systems that sometimes interweave with one another and also spill out into the mainstream, oftentimes in the form of entertainment, but from which people derive spiritual meaning from that's not connected to what we consider a mainstream religion. And these are this is a list of all the sort of aspects of the cultic milieu. So spiritualism, theosophy, magic practices, new thought that we talked about in the last couple of weeks, UFOs, wellness culture, and also, I should say, casual Western engagement with Eastern religion. So like, I'm going to a meditative retreat, but I have no background in Buddhism, right? That sort of thing also falls into this particular category of knowledge that we refer to as the cultic milieu. So that sort of gives you a frame of reference of the cultural world that we're talking about right now. Okay. So spiritualism, very broadly, or actually, broadly referred to speaking for today. It doesn't refer to being spiritual, not religious, but a lot of people who are quote unquote spiritual, not religious, may believe in this, right? Or may practice some aspect of the cultic milieu. And again, there's a lot of like overlap in this world. So when you talk to someone, you say, oh, are you spiritual? They say I'm spiritual, not religious. That doesn't mean that they are a spiritualist or that they practice spiritualism, but a good number of those people may engage in some form of spiritualist belief, right? Belief in ghosts, basically. So very, very broadly speaking, anyone who believes in ghosts or has experienced like a ghost or something like that can sort of fall under this umbrella of spiritualism. But a spiritualist is someone who actively practices the act of summoning and trying to speak with ghosts, whether it's through a medium who comes to a talk show, or a psychic who you go to who has like a little shop on the street corner, or just a bunch of teenagers sitting down with a Ouija board. That would be like an active spiritualist behavior. But again, like there's this heavy element of entertainment too. And that's also so spiritualism has always been both about trying to reach the other side, both about trying to reach the dead, both about trying to know what is beyond the veil of life and death, and also doing something fun on a Saturday. And that's part of it. I'm not being flippant, that absolutely is an element of spiritualism. And I sort of already mentioned this, you can apply, there's a lot of overlap with all these other traditions, that's why we talked about New Thought last week. A lot of the New Thought proponents and Christian Science founders and folks like that actually had connections with the spiritualist community. Helena Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society, she's sort of disseminated her New Age mystical belief system through Eastern Seaboard seances. So all of these people knew each other, right? They all knew each other, and all of these movements are interconnected. But spiritualism itself, the active practice of summoning ghosts, specifically begins in March of 1848 with these two little girls. You can say little, one was little, one was 11 years old, the other one was 14. These two young women, these two young girls, who were living in rural Connecticut, and they suddenly started hearing noises, like rapping, like things like that. And their parents suddenly started to hear it. And these girls made up a story. They said that there was a ghost who was living in the house. And suddenly people from all around wanted to come and hear the ghost. And people would come and sit down, and there were these noises, these rappings, right? Snaps, things like that. And word spread that this house was haunted, that you could come and speak to the other side. You went to the Block family's house, rural Connecticut, and you could see the other side, basically. And they became
I don't know about that.
so I'm gonna show a quick video.
Told me about it.
I told you about it?
Hold on, I need to mute
Yeah.
someone. I.e. my father. Sorry, Dad. Here we go. Maybe it'll actually go. Yes, come on.
And that the dead have reclaimed a way of communicating with the living.
And really within modern spiritualism, pivotal point of this was two children were able to create communication between two worlds. The story of the Fox sisters, it really is a roller coaster ride of humanity, spirituality, and tragedy.
Modern spiritualism began in a small town in upstate New York. Members of the local historical society often tell the tale.
Hello, my name is Kate, and here beside me is my sister Maggie. We are the famous Fox sisters who have been credited with being the founders of the modern spiritualist movement in the United States. The spirits of this lovely local cemetery graciously invited us here to tell our story.
We moved to Hydesville, New York with our parents, John and Margaret Fox, in December of 1847. I was 14 and Kate was 11.
These two young girls reported hearing strange raps in the house that their family had rented.
These raps seem to be utterly mysterious in nature. John and his wife Margaret have no idea where these noises are coming from. They haven't any idea what to make of them. They're terrifying, in effect. They're afraid, perhaps, that they're diabolical. They just don't know anything about them.
Spiritualism really did kind of burst in on the scene in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1840s. And it started with a pair of sisters in New York State, the Fox sisters.
Margaret and Kate Fox were two little girls when spiritualism started, and they lived in Hydesville, New York. And in their presence, they started hearing noises, rapping sounds.
And they were just little schoolgirls. I mean, they were just naughty little girls. And it was, I think, October. And it was the winter was coming on, and evenings are very long, and it must have been very boring. And they found that they could crack their toe joints.
And eventually they discovered that they could make a code, as in 1 rap for yes, 2 raps for no.
People obviously wanted to know if they weren't making the noises, who was and who was doing it. So they made up a story. They said that it was a man who'd lived in the house before and who'd died. He'd been murdered. You know, here was the dead coming back.
The classic story is that little Kate Fox was sitting in the room, and she went, and immediately, and then she went without making a sound, and then, and she said to her mother, "Mother, it can see as well as hear." Now, her mother was a nice Methodist woman, and she was freaked out.
And the word spread. And before anybody knew what was happening, here with these 2 naughty little girls had become a sort of cult.
The spiritualists were so determined to believe in the supernatural that 40 years later, when Margaret Fox made a full confession, admitting she had faked everything, some still refused to accept it.
It was the kind of thing that, you know, myths and fairy stories are all built on. And they'd started their own myth. And it was impossible to put a lid on it after that, because people so much wanted to communicate with the dead, because everybody knows somebody that's died. And everybody would like to be able, perhaps, to get in touch with them.
Whether it was real or not, it launched a huge movement of spiritualism. Because there was no television, one of the most popular form of entertainments was seances. Every town had 20, 30 spiritualists.
So as Jenna pulls back the slides, one of the things, I'm sorry about the sound.
Step into Wix Studio, where creative freedom.
One of the things that we can take away from this, and what happened to the Fox sisters, the first thing is that it doesn't end, obviously, with them coming clean as they were older. It had already taken off, and people believed regardless of what they had to say. And honestly, personally, I think, and there's evidence to back this up too, later studies that have been done, people kind of don't believe, or rather, it's not that they don't believe. When you enter into this, it's like you want to believe, right? To quote the X-Files. And I think that was a very, like, if any of you are X-Files fans, it's a very astute thing that Fox Mulder said on that, which is like, I want to believe. Spiritualism works, and other aspects of the cultic work because people want to believe. But the reality also, is that it's entertainment. And also, even though we know it's entertainment, we kind of want to still talk to the dead because it means talking to people whom we have lost. And so it really speaks to who we are as people. I found this meme today. I was curious. I was going through. I was wondering. I wonder if anyone's trying to do a seance online. And I like typed in like online seances, and the first thing that came up was this meme. And so I stopped. I was like, you know what? This is actually better than any sort of thing I would talk about. So I'm going to just sort of slap that up there. But really, that's kind of it is funny if you think about a Zoom call or any sort of online meeting type of thing. It does mirror the language that's used in seances. It's kind of funny how that works out. Anyway, spiritualism is a technology. And you're like, what? How is it a technology? It says it's not what we think of as technology, but it is, in the sense that it is a means for people, a medium, right, is necessary to engage in communication with another conscious entity. We use technology for that. We have a medium for that. Our phones are mediums for that, for speaking with other people, right? And in this early spiritualist heyday, the various forms of medium for communication with the dead were seen as types of technology. It was seen as a type of scientific technology in order to sit around a table and engage in certain incantations that could bring down a ghost so you could speak to. This was seen as being scientific. There also, especially when you bring in things like spirit photography, you're engaging in like an actual technological device that is meant to capture an image of the other side. Is that what it actually was doing? No, of course not. It didn't matter. People were using it for that purpose. And the same thing happens if you go on YouTube today, you type in ghost videos, and you pull up all these videos of people supposedly documenting ghosts in their house or their backyard. And sometimes they're just weird little flashes of light. And sometimes it's obviously staged, and sometimes it's staged to be fun, right? Because again, it's both entertainment and a spiritual practice. Sometimes they're kind of creepy. There are a few where you look at it and you're like, I don't know, that's kind of unnerving. But that's the whole point of this. You're supposed to be unnerved by it. It's supposed to elicit an emotional reaction, whether it's from feeling that you have touched the other side or from having the fun on a Saturday afternoon or evening. At the end of the day, though, spiritualism it was seen as a technological medium. And this makes sense because the time that spiritualism emerges, a time of great technological advancement and upheaval in the United States and elsewhere, especially in the West. So this is the era that we refer to as the Industrial Revolution. And what's happening in the Industrial Revolution? Well, we see the advent of these amazing new technologies, such as the railroad and the telegraph. And what are the railroad and the telegraph, if not a technological medium for communicating at long distances? Before the railroad, if you want to get information from New York to San Francisco, you either sent it with the Pony Express or the Wells Fargo wagon, or you got on a covered wagon yourself and you made the trek for about 5 months, braving everything you would have to brave, the elements and all sorts of like hostile, elements of crossing the continental US, or you got on a ship and you went around the tip of South America and you risked sinking, drowning. Right? At the very least, you risk getting sick with scurvy, or it was difficult to travel. It was incredibly difficult. And if that letter made it to San Francisco from New York City, it happened like 4 or 5 months later, and it was already old news basically. So there was this delay. But now there's a railroad, and so you pay to have your letter taken from New York to San Francisco, and it takes a week, maybe 2 weeks. I don't know exactly how long it would take, but that's still an amazing improvement. This would have been seen as magical, almost. It would have been seen as magical. People would have never experienced it before. And once the telegraph became a thing, all bets are off. Because now, not only does it not take 3 to 4 months to either go across on land or to go around the tip of South America, not only does it no longer take 2 weeks to go on a train, you can just send it instantaneously, your message. So if you can collapse space and collapse time, because that's what's happening. Time and space are being collapsed when it comes to communication. And you can bridge the gap. I'm sorry, Aaron here is awful. It's like a difference of 1 degree, and I had it up at 1 degree and it was too hot. And now we're down 1 degree and it's too cold. So I'm gonna go turn it off again. That's what it is. Yeah, it's not the air conditioner, everybody, it's actually ghosts. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So we're talking about a collapse of space and time. You're collapsing the distance between points on the globe, and you're collapsing the time it takes to send information. So people began to think, well, wait a minute. If I can collapse space and time, and it used to take me months to send information, and now it's near instantaneous, or a couple of weeks. Then maybe if I can talk to my cousin who's over in San Francisco, then maybe I can talk to my uncle who's dead. And this happens to coincide at a time when there were enormous numbers of dead people. What happens in the middle of the 19th century United States that regenerates huge numbers of dead people? Yeah, the Civil War. And the Civil War happens, so there's massive trauma among families who've lost loved ones in the war, both in the North and the South. But it becomes particularly acute in sort of northern and eastern seaboard communities who have access to another type of technology that emerges at the time. And that technology is technology of embalmment. So the practice of embalming corpses begins in the Civil War. Where now bodies in a war, which used to have to just be buried, right? If you had money, and if you lived in upper class society in New York or Massachusetts, you had money. And if you had money, you could pay to have your loved one who's been, killed in Gettysburg or Antietam or wherever, or somewhere in Georgia, you could pay to have that body embalmed and shipped back on the railroad, or you could send information via like a letter, or and have the body embalmed and shipped back on the railroad, and within a few days, that body that died on the Civil War battlefield would be brought back to Boston or brought back to New York City. And that would have been seen as almost mystical or magical as well. And so there's this confluence of things that are social things that are happening, this collapse of communication, or not a collapse of communication, a collapse of time and space when it comes to communication, and this fascination, this newly formed fascination with the idea of preserving the dead, and also a fascination with the dead. Moreover, these bodies are coming back and they're not, they've been embalmed and worked on. They don't look like they would look like if they had not been embalmed, right? They have a visage about them that is more human and less like a corpse. And this gets people thinking that maybe their loved ones are still there on the other side. And that's a very, very old way of thinking about the dead, right? This is what the ancient Egyptians did. The ancient Egyptians embalmed their dead in order to preserve the body so that there would be a house for Egyptians who are embalmed for their spirits to live on, right? So the connection of embalming and the idea of living on after death is a very, very old way of thinking. And this is something that people are thinking about as they begin the process, as the process of embalming becomes more and more popular in the United States. I also put this thing here about mourning the dead. Around this time, also in the late 19th century, cemeteries as we understand them today become really popular. Not just a church graveyard, but a big cemetery that's basically a park. Cemeteries were initially conceived of as, they're called parks today, they're still referred to as parks. They were conceived of as a place where you could go and be with your loved ones. It wasn't like a creepy graveyard, it wasn't like behind a church off in the woods. It was this big open space where it was like a public park, where you could picnic. That was how, that was what people thought you could do. And still today, you can find people picnicking at cemeteries. That's a relatively common thing. And what this does also is it takes away kind of the visceral terror of death, because you're no longer in this kind of creepy place where you're really, really closely connected to the bodies that are just a couple feet underground. And you know that's the case because there's almost like a spookiness about like old graveyards, right? A cemetery is impeccably manicured. The graves are all laid out neatly. There are like pristine chapels. You don't encounter the dead bodies at all. It's done by the mortuary. The mortuary takes care of it. They embalm the bodies. The body is put in the casket. You only look at the body if you ask for open casket, and which actually, is now we can do that because of embalming, right? It becomes more popular. And so death becomes sort of sanitized, and people lose a bit of their fear of death. And in losing that fear of death, they also start to think about what life is like, and think more about what life might be like after death. Not that we might be out in a heavenly type of place, but that the dead are here and they are talking to us, and when we listen, we can hear what they have to say. So all of those things give rise to the social conditions, or rather, these all give rise to the social conditions that leads to spiritualism. And finally, I mentioned this process, why photography is important as well. It's another important technological advancement that leads to this. People start using the medium of photography to not just capture ghosts, but to try to capture their loved ones in their natural, what you would see as their natural state in perpetuity. In this process that's known as corpse photography. So what people would do is they're involved in loved ones, and if you have more money to pay for a better involvement, their involved loved ones, they would have them dressed up and seated in natural poses, not in repose, right, in the coffin, right, in the casket, but sitting they would take photographs with their deceased relatives. Like they would take, so oftentimes at like the dinner table, or in their favorite chair, or with their grandchildren, or if it was a child who had passed away with their parents, the whole family would gather around with their deceased loved ones, and before the burial would happen, these photographs would be taken. So this is the warning I told you, that the next slide, there are, there's images of this, and then after we look at these slides, We'll take about 5 minutes for questions and then we'll move on. All right. So these are corpse photographs from the 19th century. And there are some that are done better than others. And so again, this is a situation where you had more money, you would get better work done on your loved one, right? And you can basically tell the whole purpose is to try to make these individuals seem alive, not unlike an open casket. And I want to be really clear about that. We still do this today. We don't take photographs, but this is where the phenomenon of an American style open casket comes from this. Nobody props up their dead loved ones anymore. That's not, as far as I know, that's not happening. And nobody takes photographs of the dead in the casket, as far as I know, for the most part. I mean, that would be, I've never seen that happen. But viewing the dead person and having them look like they're somewhat lifelike, that has roots in this practice. And then the whole purpose is to have their memory live on after death, and a bit of themselves live on after death. So that's what's happening here. And it was very, very common with children, especially if you had the money to do this. If you had a child who died, this is a time when like child mortality was high, even for the upper class, then you would probably pay to have your child involved, and then you would take photographs with your child because you're obviously didn't get a chance to do that in life, right? Because photography itself was expensive. To get a family portrait was very expensive all big affair, and it was just hard to do. So if your child died before you could do that, well, this is your last chance to do that, right? And so that's what's happening here. You see various forms of corpse photography, and you can probably tell who's alive and who's not. All right, so on that note, let's do some questions. Let me start with questions for the folks who are online, and then we'll take a few questions for everyone who's in the oh no, I was going to do spirit photography first. Is that what I said? Oh, I did say that. Okay. So I'm sorry, everybody. We'll do some spirit photography and then we'll do questions further. Another technology, right?
Yeah, do you see it? No, I can see what they were.
Yeah, so you see the ghosts behind these folks? Yeah, if you look closely, again, 19th century portraiture, and then behind them, you start with like the hands that are on their shoulders. You can see the ghost behind there.
Cool?
So this was, at least as far as we know, invented by a photographer in Boston named William H. Mumler. And it's a great name. It was such a 19th century name, William Mumler. I love these names. It's like last week we talked about Phineas Whitby, right? These names they're so 19th century. Beautiful. So William Mumler was a photographer, and he was working on some portraits. And he took a photograph of one of his friends, and he was developing the photograph, and he noticed what he saw in the background as he was developing this photograph was a ghostly, like, ethereal presence, right? And he did it again, and he saw that this ghostly presence was popping up again. And he determined that through some process or some recipe of whatever chemicals he was using in his photography, in this early form of developing photography, he determined that there were ghosts who were appearing, and he was a medium. And through his photography, the spirit world had decided that spirits would come and like appear in his photographs. And so he stops being a general family, portrait taker, a local portrait taker and photographer, and he becomes a spirit photographer. And he sells these images to people who would come and would pay him money, and he would take a portrait of them, and then a ghost would appear in the background. And then it'd be up to people to determine how the ghost was connected to them. And people would say, oh, it looks like my great uncle. I haven't seen my great uncle since I was like 4 years old, but I know that's him. And by the way, this is still something people do today when they are seances and cold readings, talk shows. The person will say, I see someone who has really long hair behind you. And they're like, oh, that's my great aunt. It was the same sort of thing that was happening. And so these images would appear. And he became super popular, to the point where the famous people were seeking him out to have their photograph taken and for their loved ones to appear. And he oversteps. And word gets around, and he takes a photograph of someone who is really, really famous. Do any of you know who this is? And maybe you can tell by looking at the ghost, maybe you can figure it out. Kind of fun. If you know the story, keep quiet.
Um,
Hey, Rose, you're John. That's Mary Todd. Yeah, that's Mary Todd Lincoln, and that, if you sort of look closely, there's this hair, that's Abraham Lincoln, he's sort of looming over here in the background. And when this happens, and word got out that Mary Todd Lincoln, who was a known spiritualist, she was known to have seances in, after her and Abraham Lincoln's son, I forget the name of the son, after he died, young, she became a really intense spiritualist and had seances in the White House. This was a really common thing. She regularly had seances in the White House. And so she was like a perfect mark for Mummler, but at the same time, this would end up spelling his downfall because the word got out that like, oh, he just bamboozled the president's widow, and like things were still really raw about who he assassinated. That makes sense, right? And so a number of newspapers decided to take Mummler out, and I believe they were bankrolled by P.T. Barnum, who was notorious. He was the circus magnate. He was notorious for trying to expose hucksterism in all its forms. And he
So
also,
as to not be exposed himself?
well, so Jenna said so as to not be exposed himself. He was honest about his hucksterism. He would say that it's all a show, right? So, but he didn't go after people who were saying that it wasn't a show, that it was real. He also goes after Mary Baker Eddy at one point. So it was one of his things that he would do. And so they start investigating, and then they get another break in this expose of Mummler. They get this other break where a client goes into Mummler and asks to have a photograph taken, and the ghost appears in the photograph, and the client looks at it and says, I know that person, but that person's still alive. There was just like a person, he somehow captured an image of like a random like person in Boston, and this happened to be an acquaintance of the person who had gone and asked me for a photograph. And at that point, the newspapers grab a hold of this, and he is, run out of town, and he ends up dying in poverty in like rural Georgia. And it comes out that he was doing this type of double exposure. And I don't know the science of photography that well. I took a photography class in high school, but I don't know it as well. But he was basically double exposing his images, and it was obvious when, as then these newspaper reporters started going over all his work, they could trace back images, like images that he stole to these double exposures. But spirit photography doesn't go away. And its heir, what still exists today, are YouTube videos of ghosts, right? Capturing ghosts on camera starts with this, but is still around today. And if any of us believe that those are ghosts on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, for the most part, no. But we still watch them, or maybe not all of us, but many of us still watch them because it's entertaining, and many of us also want to believe. I'm not saying I do, but I know this is why people are into this. Okay, let's take some questions. First from people online. Good reference, Dad. That's a Ghostbusters reference.
I ain't afraid of them.
Okay, questions in the room. Let's do 3 questions.
In the Jewish tradition, you do not have an open casket.
Yeah. So this is here. So Larry asked if it's a Jewish tradition that we don't have an open casket. Yeah, by and large, that's not the case. And forgive me, I don't know the theological reasons behind that, and I don't know if it's a cultural reason. I have seen some in the United States. I've been like Hillside where they've had them, and like the mortuary, the cemetery, right, is not going to say no to a customer. But yeah, by and large, that's not a thing. But this sort of thing wasn't really. It wasn't so much, that aspect of it wasn't really happening in Jewish communities. Other things that spirit photography were. This guy, you're gonna answer that question, it counts as one of them.
To jump off of that, yeah, it's a very, well, I think one of the reasons behind it is exposure to death for ritual impurity in Judaism. And there's a very high profile case from Sandy Hook, the Sandy Hook school murders, where one of the families was Jewish and they had an open casket funeral as a way of trying to dispel the conspiracy theories that were already swirling around.
Thank you. Yeah.
Actually, it's common, not question, to tell you that recently I've seen examples of both of these things. We had a colleague had a stillborn birth a year ago. She posted image after image after image like this baby. She didn't warn us first, but she was having problems because it was a very rare condition where normally a mother passes away and the baby survives. And then, so her brain wasn't thinking clearly, but she continued to post different relatives holding this baby. It was very unusual. And then there is a photographer I've seen who knowingly, not as trying to trick somebody, who does make pictures of maybe where a father has died and there's the mother and the child and the dad's ghostly type look image. But she's not trying to fool anyone. The family sets this up for this. They're actually beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of going on. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the former case, I mean, first of all, that's kind of a level situation. No comment about it, but think about that. And that feels to me though, and I can't speak for sure, because someone you know, I certainly know the person, that feels like an expression of like deeply agree. Whereas spirit or corporate photography was like cultural phenomenon. And then in regards to the spirit photography that you were talking about, he's not going to trick anyone, and I believe that because part of this is the entertainment is legitimate religious behavior, right? It's legitimate spiritual behavior. I try not to look at people engaging in entertainment of this sort and saying, well, it's not real, it's not real spirituality. No, it is real. Yeah, it's entertainment, it's fun, but honestly, is it fun to come here on forum? Yeah, it is, right? I'm sorry, Jay, it's hard work. The idea is that it's a very different type of spiritual entertainment, obviously, but the premise is similar. Like spirituality can be fun, and spiritualism is all about having fun while talking to those and believing something. Real fast, no? It's very fast. Actually, within the last 10 years, Cal State Fullerton actually posted at one point the largest private collection of Victorian post-mortem photography, actually, and it was very fascinating. That's really cool. Awesome. Okay, so let's what does this have to do with Jews? And the reality is that Jews throughout the world, actually, at first I thought it was just in Europe, and then I found this amazing scholar who is a Jewish scholar who did his dissertation on Judaism and spiritualism. And this is actually, it's primarily in Ashkenazi spaces, but the fact of the matter is it ends up like touching almost every Jewish community in the world, which is really, really fascinating, because that doesn't happen in Christian communities, and yet it does happen in Jewish communities. So for a time being, really right up until the 1940s, for obvious reasons, there is this fascination with talking with the dead. So these like two images here, this is an advertisement for a Jewish psychic, and then this is an advertisement for a talk being given by the very Reverend Dr. Moses Gasker, who is a prominent rabbi in London, who is in favor of spiritualism. Not just a prominent rabbi, this is a prominent Orthodox and Sephardi rabbi. So oftentimes, like I was thinking this was all going to be Ashkenazi, and it's not. It's actually across the board. So what happens in the Jewish communities in the 19th century that would lead towards an attachment to spiritualism? Well, it's similar to non-Jewish communities. There is major social and political and technological upheaval. So we talked about this in our last session. We talked about like Chantal Tzvi and the hospital and stuff like that. The Jewish community in the 19th century is encountering all sorts of change. It's encountering immigration change, meaning people are leaving Europe and coming to the United States, or leaving Europe and going to what is then called, the Ottoman occupied Palestine at that point. There are change of religious outlooks. There's the Haskalah, which brings about the Reform movement. There is the flowering of initially of Hasidic movements, and then sort of like the Hasidic movements sort of become like calcified and become a little bit like corrupt. But ultimately there are changes within the world of Hasidism. And then at the same time, you have these technological changes. So we sometimes think of like Judaism in the 19th century, we think of Tepia, right? And we think of Anatevka and the shtetl. But of course, the reality is a lot more complex than that. You have Jews in urban areas, particularly in the United States, who are very connected to new technological advances, like the railroad and like the telegraph and like the camera and things like that, like photography. And you also have, just like in non-Jewish spaces in the United States, among Jews, particularly in Europe, you have the pogroms that are happening in the Pale of Settlement. And so you have mass death that's occurring. And so as people leave the Pale of Settlement and they go to other parts of the world, they are missing their loved ones, especially those who they can't write back to in Europe because they're dead. And so they try to find ways, Jews try to find ways to reach those loved ones who have died in the pogroms, who didn't make it over in some way, or who they've lost touch with, right? Because it's not just mediums that appear in the Jewish community, it's also psychics as well, because psychics can find somebody who's missing. So if you have cousin or brother who went over to the US before you, or if you're a woman who had a husband who just absconded, when you get to New York, you can find a psychic. The psychic will help find them, right? So these mediums appear in gray. They're very prolific in Jewish spaces, particularly in urban spaces, but in non-urban spaces as well. And it really it happens everywhere, like I said, but it really takes off in the US, because the US is the center of spiritualism in the world. So especially in places like New York, and New York is, it's really New York, but also Philadelphia and Boston, where there's lots of Jews. This is also where non-Jews are gathering together and holding their seances. It's where they're getting together and they're talking with ghosts. And so people in their social class would also be going to these, and they also would be fascinated by this. And so you see a bit of syncretism that's happening as well. Okay. But it's not just people sort of doing this on the slide. This is also either supported or condemned by Jewish religious establishment figures. And it's not just unorthodox who are in favor of this, although primarily initially it's folks among the Haskalim, right? It's the reformers. And it's the reform movement, particularly in Europe and in the United States, who initially sort of formed these initial forays into spiritualism. Because spiritualism is seen as an empirical science in the 19th century. So today we look at it and we're like, that's not science, come on. But at the time it was, right? Because most people didn't have a general good understanding what scientific method was. Scientific method as we understand it today isn't really fully formed in certainly popular consciousness in the 19th century. And so what scientific method meant for most people is that my experience is that this worked for me. And all these other people say it worked for them. And we all sat around the table and the ghost came and we heard the ghost. So that counts, right? And people, these what are called psychical journals or metaphysical journals pop up where people talk about these experiences, and that is printed as being empirical. So the Haskalah, the Haskalim, meaning the reformers, Reformed Jews, were very interested in finding things that were empirical and scientific about Judaism, right? And finding things that they could prove that made Judaism and their form of Judaism rational, logical, and scientific. And because speaking to ghosts was seen as a rational, logical, scientific endeavor in the 19th century, the reformers, by and large, embraced this, both in Europe and in the United States. It was very popular among Reformed Jews. This also makes sense because Reformed Jews in Europe, but especially in the United States at the time, were upper class primarily, or at least upper middle class, right? Not upper class aristocracy, but upper middle class, especially in the US. And the Reform movement was very interested in engaging in assimilationist practices. And so if you were a Reformed Jew at the time and you lived in like upper class New York society, you wanted to do what your non-Jewish neighbors were doing. And what your non-Jewish neighbors were doing on a Friday night, right? Not just a Saturday night, but a Friday night. What they were doing was summoning ghosts, then you would go and do that too. And also it was fun, right? It's fun. It was fun. It was entertaining. So, but it also took place among Hasidim, who saw, tried to summon ghosts to doing seances. They saw it as a type of way to connect to the higher spiritual source, so they can connect to Hashem, right? Like in a way to prove that the soul continued on after death and was sort of in the light of God. They saw this as a holy endeavor. Not all of them. There were many Hasidim who saw this as a problem, and there were many Orthodox Jews who were not in favor of this, who saw this as being an affront to the Torah and an affront to Judaism. But even with the Orthodox, this is something that would happen. And one of the reasons that this was the case, again, and I have to hammer this point home, is because it was fun. So if you lived, I put egalitarian in scope, meaning that poor Jews and rich Jews end up doing this by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Because if you lived in New York and you had nothing to do on Friday or Saturday night, you were a reformer, right? And your friends, neighbors were putting together a seance, you would go and do that, what you would do. But also, if you were poor and you lived in a shtetl in Poland, and you had nothing to do after Havdalah, and it was cold, and it's winter, right? You might gather people together in your in your home, and you might have a seance and try to summon a loved one who has passed away. So these are things that are happening among the upper class Jewish society and the lower class Jewish society, and it's something that's happening for Ashkenazi, and it's something that's happening for Sephardim and Mizrahim as well. There are numerous spiritualist societies that pop up in Cairo, right? And then numerous ones that pop up in Jerusalem. At this time, there's not a huge number of Ashkenazi Jews who are in this region, but other Jews are picking it up as well. And that sort of speaks to how important this becomes in Jewish culture at the time. So mediums and psychics, I sort of already hinted this, they actually end up, especially in New York, they end up performing a number of social services. I kind of already mentioned that. One of the social services that they do is they find lost people, right? Sometimes they find lost items, but the number one thing that they do is they find husbands and fathers who have run away, right? And it's to the point where the spiritualists and the psychics end up working in tandem, not just each other in the community, but with major Jewish newspapers like the Forward. So the Jewish Forward, Jewish Daily Forward, now it's just the Forward. They have a list, hundreds from this period, of missing husbands, right? And the spiritualists would use these lists, especially if somebody went and sought them out and paid them to help find their husband. They'd use these lists and they would use their powers to find the person, but also they had very, very, very deep and invested social networks, so that they were able to gain information from everyone who they knew in the community to try to find out where these people were. And it ranged from folks like Dr. Abraham Hochman, who became so well known and popular that he was like, there were glowing stories about him in the New York Times, and that he actually was picked up by the NYPD to help solve crimes, right? That's how well known this guy came. He was like a really, really big deal. But most of the psychics who worked in the tenements weren't men, and they weren't well-to-do. Most of them were poor women, poor Jewish immigrants who were women, right? And so this is a advertisement. This was actually found when the Tenement Museum in New York, maybe you've been to the Tenement Museum in New York? Okay, so when the Tenement Museum in New York was being, when the tenement itself, the building was renovated and turned into a museum, this business card was found. And it means that this individual, Dora Metzler, whoever she was, we don't know who she was, lived there. And she probably did her psychic work in this community.
It says between Delancey and Broome Street, so yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah. So she is an advertisement for her. She's an unexcelled psalmist, palmist, tells you the past, present, and future, gives the best advice in business, journeys, law, lawsuits, love, sickness, family, and then family affairs. And really her number one, and other psychics like this, their number one source of business would have been this sort of family affairs, finding people who had managed, usually of their own accord, right? And then sort of bringing them back. And there were many, many like here. So here's a few in Yiddish. Let me see if I can find, I have the translation. Let me quickly pull that up. Seconds.
So cool.
Okay. So this is another advertisement for another psychic named Stenia Broder, right? And it's an advertisement for to come to her house between 10 and 6 p.m. Or to her office, and then there's a hotel that she's in, and it's basically about her prices being affordable. So again, I don't really translate Yiddish, I'm not really good at that, but that's the basic gist of what's happening here. And then this one, I forgot to do a translation on this, but this is another psychic advertisement. Would have been prevalent. This one's in Russian and Yiddish, which is really best. All right.
So like a phrenologist, is that?
Oh, yeah, very, thank you. This is a phrenologist as well, right? A phrenologist studies the shape of the human skull in order to determine characteristics. When we talk about race and religion, race and Judaism, we'll talk about that a little bit, but not too much right now. But yeah, phrenology, absolutely. All right. So there is one of the really fascinating things about Judaism and spiritualism, particularly in the United States, is that it is heavily female-based, right? Most of the spiritualists in the U.S. Who are Jewish, right, or are not the most prominent ones necessarily, but most of the people actually doing it are women. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the things I find interesting, though, within spiritualism itself, we have a long line of founders and important figures in the spiritualist and cultic milieu movements. So within American esoteric in general, so like Mary Baker Eddy, Helen Blavatsky, Mother Ann Lee of the Shakers, there's a number of, the Universal Friend, there's a number of other ones as well. So that kind of carries over here. But within Jewish spaces, you have Jewish women are very, there are many, many Jewish women who become mediums. And this makes sense because the seance itself is in a domestic setting. So if you were going to invite people over to your home, then the person who's in charge of the domesticity of the home is usually the wife or mother figure at home, right? Even in upper class societies, especially in upper class societies. So the organization of the seance would be done by women, right? There may be men who are sort of like in the background and there's male control that's still present, but much of the actual functioning of the seances and this movement in general is done by women because it happens in a domestic setting. And then this is, I find to be really interesting. It gives women at the time a sense of power that male counterparts had that they didn't have. And that's the power of spiritual and educational authority. So what that means essentially is that as opposed to male figures who are rabbis, who read Torah, who engage in prayers, who do all the rituals, right? So they have that spiritual authority, but in the home, they don't have authority. The women have authority in the home, and it's the women who are holding seances in the home, and that means that they have more education about the other side, more education about spiritualism, and they become authorities, spiritual authorities, when it comes to this sort of ritual. And this is something that they did not have in other aspects, that women just didn't have in other aspects of Jewish life at the time. Even within the Reform movement, which was still overwhelmingly male, right? And will be until the middle, towards the end of the 20th century. So yeah, are we?
That was all that was on that side.
Oh, there was one more thing.
Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, we can still. Okay. So I thought we would talk a little bit before we end about just a couple figures, a couple of Jewish women who are mediums, and then a Jewish spirit photographer. So quickly talk about Regina Miriam Bloch. She founds the American Society for Psychical Research. So this is one of those metaphysical societies, generates journals. A lot of this comes in the vein of the Theosophical Society, which was very prominent in these spaces. And her interest in this may have begun just as a means to talk to people on the other side, but ultimately she derives a deep sense of spirituality from this, a spirituality that she connects to Judaism. So she doesn't do this and say like, Judaism's nonsense, I'm giving this up, I'm just gonna talk with ghosts. No, she doesn't do it. And there were Christian mediums who did that, right? Who were like, I don't really believe in this, but what I really believe in what's on the other side, right? She doesn't do that. She sees spiritualism as a means to revive Jewish spirituality. As people are coming over and assimilating, especially in Reform circles, you have this drive towards assimilation. She asks this question, how can we bring people back to Judaism? We can do it by infusing Judaism with a direct line to the spirit, and that is spirituality. And this is at the same time when Zionism is beginning to like emerge and hold in Jewish imagination, Jewish consciousness. So she says, I found this quote absolutely fascinating first. She writes, Judaism is a living religion teeming with mysticism. In caring for the materialistic side of life, the Jew has lost traditions that were once his. The time has come to clear away the smoke from the altar fire. The Jewish people are flocking back to Zion. Would that they would flock to the Zion of the Spirit. Right? It's fascinating. So it's like a rebuke of this early form of political Zionism in an attempt to say that there needs to be a spiritual revival, and spiritualism, talking with ghosts, can help make that happen. All right, so another very prominent female medium, Jewish medium at the time, was Matilda Levy. And she doesn't go into it in order to reform Judaism, right? Even though she also was a Reform Jew, both of these individuals were part of the Reform movement. But she enters into it because she loses her daughter. Her daughter died unexpectedly and relatively young, and she was in her teens. And Matilda Levy is very, very distraught. And in consultation with her rabbi says, you should go talk to a medium. You should speak to the spiritualist. They can help get you in touch with your daughter. Because remember, this is seen as empirical. This is seen as scientific at the time. The reformers embraced it. And so she goes and she meets with the medium, and she believes that she speaks with her daughter. In fact, after she becomes a prominent medium and channeler, because after a while she starts channeling her own daughter. And channeling is a practice of having ghosts speak through you. So if you are engaging in a seance, the spirits come down to us, show us that you're here, right? And you hear knocking, right? I think that's one way that they can appear. But if it's a really dramatic situation, the medium can channel, and they'll start articulating in a different voice, and that's the ghost coming through in their voice, right? And we can look at that and say it's like an act, but for people who are there, it's very, very real. And it was real to her, and then she ends up channeling her daughter. And her daughter says, though the earth crumbles and stars fail to shine, remember, mother dear, we will be together in time. Let your heart stop aching, stop looking forlorn. There's always a dawning with every newborn. It's what her daughter says to her in the midst of one of these seances. And she is so moved that she decides that she has to bring spiritualism to the Jewish community. She doesn't want to convert Jews out of Judaism, but she thinks that Jews need this form of spirituality. It is something that is, on a personal level, essential. And people start following her. And she actually forms her own little second society of like-minded Jews, and almost as a sort of little congregation, right? As a rabbi or a cantor, this Jewish community is all people who do seances and channel and that sort of thing, right? So she actually forms a spiritualist community. And she wants to make a spiritualist community that not only helps people emotionally, but also is inherently Jewish. Because other spiritualist communities were, even if it wasn't as expressly Christian, most of the people who there were Christians, and they saw things in a Christian way. And she wanted to create a space where people could engage in seances in a Jewish sort of way. So one of the things she would do is they would say Kaddish before doing the summoning, right? And then they would say Shema afterwards, right? So they would incorporate Jewish prayers into the ritual of the seance. Yeah, it's very cool. All right, so what were some of the rabbinic responses? I know that we're running, I want to quickly go through this. Thank you very much. There were negative responses. Negative responses from some rabbis were like, the Torah prohibits it. You can't do it. Not acceptable, right? This is evil. But also there were positive responses, right? For Reform Jews, spiritualism offered empirical proof of the transcendence of the soul. So therefore, the Reform movement, spiritualism was allowed. But also in some Orthodox movements, spiritualism was allowed because for that same reason, right? If you could talk to your loved one, this isn't the type of summoning that happens in the Torah. This is something that's kosher. And then sort of a neutral position, right? I wouldn't do it, but some rabbis were saying this. I wouldn't do it, but we can learn about it from just watching it, right? Sort of like a backdoor way to engaging in it. But ultimately, there's also this concern among male authorities that there's women who are leading this, but ultimately ends up being sort of a moot point because spiritualism in Jewish spaces falls away after the First World War as, anti-Semitism picks up in Europe and the tensions very much drawn to that. Other things in eclipsing Jewish spiritualist movements. Okay, real fast. We have our own spirit photographer like William Mumler. His name was John Myers. He frequented London seances and he gained the support of this very prominent and respected Sephardi rabbi named Rabbi Moses Gaster, who was very prominent in spiritual spaces. And he takes a photograph of Gaster, that's him up there. This is the Sephardi rabbi. He takes a photograph of him. And then he says, well, look who's come to see you, because this happens in London. It's the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, it's Benjamin Disraeli, right? And Gaster was like, yes, this is true. I experienced this, it really happened. You have to believe this sort of thing. And then he takes others, and one of his other famous photographs is of the Jewish playwright Israel Zangwill. Zangwill coined the phrase the melting pot, referring to American culture. He takes this photograph of Zangwill, that's right there. When he does that, the British newspapers decide to go after him. They're like, this guy's full of weed, expose him for the fraud he is. And they eventually find that this image of Zangwill comes from another reporter had taken the image some years later, and it was seen that you sort of see the process of it. You can see how it's the same photograph, and he gets exposed to the fraud, and he basically falls from grace, although Gaster continued to support him. You say it's legitimate the rest of his life. Anyway, the way he did it was similar to how Mumler did it, another type of all right, we'll end it there. I'm sorry, thank you for bearing with me. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, Sean.
Thoroughly enjoyed that. Anything here? All right.
So I didn't ask the question, why do I want to believe in ghosts?
Why would you want to believe in ghosts? Because it's fun. Literally, that's the reason.
I mean, I saw that, but I'm suspecting that people back in those days, a lot of them took it serious.
See you all next
Bye,
week.
everyone. I hope you enjoyed yourselves.
You can see everyone now.
I hope you all had fun. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Sean.
I'll see you next week.
Right.
So I'm sorry, what was your question?